Hello everyone. This is Dr. Paco Mejias and Tanzil Shafique from Estudio Abierto Open Studio, which is a think plus do tank for architecture and urbanism. And we're honored to be part of this conference, and we will be presenting a paper titled Cities, Communities, and Homes as Blind Fields, a Lefebvreian Analysis. So basically what we would like to do in this paper is see how these entities, cities, communities, and homes have created certain zones of blindness, and basically we would like to have some design proposals, the design outcomes that can guide us to overcome the blindness. So to begin, the understanding of cities, communities, and homes, rather than being discrete autonomous entities, can be seen as parts of the same continuum, which parallelly reveals our failure in projecting them in a cohesive way. In our attempt to find where is the origin of such a disconnection, we are paradoxically sent back to the origin of architecture as an official discipline. What we'd like to point out is, instead of seeing them as discrete objects, we can start to see them as part of a spectrum. The formality of the Acropolis and the Roman Forum have little to do with the rich messiness of the homes that created most of the urban tissue in ancient Athens or Rome. The causal processes generating the civic fabrics of the old cities were always far from the commandeering decisions in charge of the significant architecture that provided the formal architectural monumentality to the city. This disconnection was an unintended expression of the social and economic differences between the socio-political elite and the common people inhabiting these cities. Difference that became much more evident in the capital cities, where the political power is usually more explicitly manifested. Cities were planned with a strong dismissal of the community life and the differences between the official architecture serving the status quo and the causal character of the architecture of homes became a very clear expression of this disconnection. Official architecture was from its beginning an authoritarian tool for expressing power, and we are still under the influence of this stigma that explains the disconnection between cities, which is a political entity, communities, which is a social one, and the homes, which is more an emotional unit of human cohabitation. Even when we recognize in each of us the confluence of an emotional human being, a social person, and a political citizen, these differences become pathological when one of these roles acts against the others. This confrontation is at the base of the disconnection we are trying to explain in this paper. If we study the urban fabric of more politically neutral old cities, as for instance in any small village in so many places all over the world, we can notice a much stronger feeling of connectivity between these three levels of cohabitation. In these relatively politically inactive places, without formal architecture, we can recognize the importance of the residential fabric in creating the public space, which also entails framing and accommodating community life, resulting in cities with a very strong identity and a very effective way of functioning as a social institution. In these places, the official planning and architecture are almost non-existent, and even if they manifest in specific moments, as in a church or the city hall, they are usually embedded into the civic fabric. It does this with a very moving modesty that tries to recognize the importance of homes and communities, which is the emotional and social glue of the city, against its own political expression of power. If we observe the informal settlements, as you can see in the slide, where the official architecture is non-existent based on its subversive condition and its intentional denial of political statements, we could find communities extraordinarily resilient, a resiliency that's based on their social and affectional ties, which is in its community and homely values. Hence, the slums become efficient territories of self-governance and social resiliency that resist the political control, and not surprisingly, the authorities have tried to discredit them historically through the false identification between anarchy and absolute chaos. The efficiency of these territories of anarchy is also a reflection of its condition of an architecture or without a leader for the build, which is to say a more bottom-up process. Tracking this issue throughout the 20th century, we find a continuation of the disconnection between the three scales of a city's making. The modernist movement in architecture was extremely focused on the idea of the whole city as an artifact, planning carefully how the different parts of the machinery would work together with a very scarce consideration of how this would affect the two minor scales, namely communities and homes. Coming from a mechanistic clockwork universe model, modern planners usually refuse the existing communities of the city as a fundamental base for the planning, and they were reticent to accept the existing entities as the necessary background of the new planning. Instead of thinking in terms of emergence and evolution, the pursuit of novelty pervaded modernity. The arrogance of the modern planner wasn't so different to the one of the modern artist, and both expressively refused to regard any pre-existing norm as necessary or valid anymore. In the smaller scale of the house, the modern architect systematically ignored people's concerns and aspirations, creating with this a growing gap between architects and society, a gap that lasts to this day. The question about a more effective consideration of the habitation was also a strong controversy between the modernists themselves, which finally caused the dissolution of the Siam tangled in the habitat discussions. A case in point is Michelangelo Antonioni's film Red Desert, where you can see on the right a kind of alienation portrayed by the female protagonist being alienated in her home, which you can see is a very modernist abstract space, and also kind of like a very industrial cityscape, which produces alienation both in the home and also in the city. And in both cases, the community of the family suffers, and the community of the city as a whole suffers. The second significant moment in the planning of the city during the 20th century was the suburban phenomenon that spread especially in the post-war period. The new towns in the United Kingdom were a romantic recuperation of Ebenezer Howard's old idea of the garden city, based on the recognition of the modern planners' failure of dealing with the complexity of the modern city. Confused between the plans for the post-war reconstruction, the new towns were a clear dissolution of the city as it overplayed a home-focused plan. The bucolic idea of living in the country in a poor quality architecture, if we say from a disciplinary standpoint, which were stylized with a neo-vernacular cliché, was sold to the people, which were usually young families from the low-medium class, as a classy object of desire, and they bought it as a possibility for skipping their rather meaningless lives. The houses were carefully planned following design manuals developed by the British government's design offices with the idea of engaging not people not through architectonic quality but with a kind of social realism populism formula. The operation was also done with an absolute dismissal of the existing communities living in the small places where the new towns were established, creating with this an irresolvable conflict between the new and the old inhabitants. The social and racial uniformity of the new communities made authentic social ghettos from the new towns, and the program resulted in a deafening failure to create community identities, which paradoxically also caused the dissolution of the pre existing ones. In the American context, the development of the suburbia was suffering similar problems. Based also in the idea of selling dream homes for the middle class, the post war extension of American suburbs wasn't rooted in the growing complexity of the existing city, but in the recognition of an American idiosyncrasy grounded in the denial of a life in community and towards a more individuality based life. The settler spirit was established as a one-on-one connection between the inhabitants and the inhabited land, as Frank Lloyd Wright had reflected in his Broadacre City, which we can term as an anti-city utopia for the American urbanism, which was based on his ideas expressed in the same year in a book called The Disappearing City, where basically the idea was that it would spread indefinitely over the continental United States and each family would get 1 acre. So basically it was a dissolution of the city and kind of like a desire of a suburban was established through this project. The other case in point is actually the case study houses program launched by the Arts and Architecture magazine and supported by public initiative after the World War II, which included proposals by some of the most prolific and significant American modern architects, and it was just nothing more than a modern style home option for materializing the official idea of rehoming 3 million soldiers coming back from the front in suburban neighborhoods. It was very home focused and did not consider about how communities would be created in these neighborhoods. The architecture of the house had little effect on generating a thriving community, and inversely, the spreading sprawl only had a negative impact on the communities. The suburban phenomenon in both contexts wasn't exempt of political and economic intentions and resulted in a huge fiasco in creating community life and social resiliency. This was again a consequence of a home-based thinking, dismissing the city and the communities. In both cases, British new towns and American suburbia, the ultimate victim was the third place. Ray Oldenburg, the American sociologist, defines third places as in-between places that allow an informal public life, such as the American taverns, the British pub, the coffee shops, the food carts, etc. Since the discipline of architecture was concerned only with the formal processes, it disregarded the importance of the third places as a social glue that holds the first place, home, and the second place, work. We assert that these places were lost in the blind fields of modernity. If we look at the self-called American New Urbanism, before we move into that, we would like to point out that for example, the third place, to elaborate that, the American tavern, which was instrumental in kind of like formation of the idea of the American nationhood, and basically it acted as a place where dissent was formed. And then, as you can see, the painting by John Lewis Krimmel, The Village Tavern, in 1814 in Philadelphia, kind of like where it shows how it played a part in the democratization of public life in the early republic. Uh, and to continue what I was talking about in the American New Urbanism, which can be termed as one of the most successful trends in American city planning since the 1990s, we can find again the recurrent disconnection between the three scales studied in this paper. In this case, based on a pretentious idea of community, all the principles defended by the new urbanism, including the idea of the transit-oriented development, are deeply suburban, denying the city as a more complex way of living. New urbanism proposes a planning based on the idea of community, but with a very poor understanding of what the communal is, caught in the idea of a controlled neighborhood where problems of scale doesn't need to be addressed and the conflict of the real city are almost non-existent, symbolized well by the orderliness of the town in the movie The Truman Show by Peter Weir. Ironically, the filming location of the movie Truman Show was the town Seaside, which we showed in the previous slide. So, which only proves the point that the Truman Show, where a reality show was framed, so a fake community was placed, the architecture of Seaside kind of was perfect to portray that. So what we'd like to say here is the homes that conform to the suburban fabrics of the new urbanism, on the scale of the homes, they are formalistic regurgitations based on a populist elitism that uses materials in a fake way and a collage of older typologies for pretending the spontaneity of an urban village only formally, paradoxically through strongly coded plans. In this case, the city and the homes are dismissed and the planning appears just as a tool for the creation of a community deeply rooted in the idea of exclusivity. Instead of seeing the community as a spectrum that ranges from the home to the city, new urbanists fixated community as a discrete object in itself, which is precisely why their neighborhoods are not one. Communities happen in productive cracks between the homes, in aggregation, and in their relation to the city, and cannot exist independently without these relational aspects. With a modernity focused in the city as an artifact at the beginning of the century, a suburban trend centered on the home in the second half, and the new urbanism referring, if we might add very poorly, to the community at the end of the century, the 20th century has been a confirmation of the difficulties of thinking in a cohesive way about cities, communities, and homes for fronting the planning of the city. So the cities or community or home. So we can see modernity's failure to see the complexity and interplay of the three. When we can say that there is a blindness, which is curious because André Lefebvre pointed in his book The Urban Revolution in 1970 a similar phenomenon. He said that the three fields that started the transformation of people's life from the Industrial Revolution, the rural, the industrial, and the urban, showed a common difficulty in being thought of together despite their interdependence. The rural environment covering our basic needs, the industrial one framing the workspace, and the urban context as the place for the enjoyment conform a whole scope of human beings' activities, which he says was a tripartite division that is found in every social practice. Between these fields, which Lefebvre qualified as regions of force and conflict, there are blind fields that we are not able to see and that are very significant for understanding the connections between the fields and their hybrid conditions. This effect is due to the blinding causes, the luminous sources, which Lefebvre identified with knowledge, with two factors, knowledge as the first one and ideology as the second, which are seen as inevitable factors that strongly condition the way we see things. These factors are also able to explain the impossibility of thinking cities, communities, and homes as interconnected realities very strongly, as we have seen in the 20th century. An ambience of extreme rationality, increasingly growing from the Industrial Revolution's era, was strongly present in the architectural avant-garde at the beginning of the 20th century. Although some of the avant-garde masters' writings were a confusing mix of reason and emotions, as Walter Gropius or Le Corbusier, for instance, the rationality was in the end the argument more publicized for explaining the new architecture. The same idea is seen in the international style, which portrayed itself as an undeniable architectural truth, which was rooted in this scientific mode where knowledge is the definitive target of human life and, as universal knowledge, does not need to change due to contextual situations, which is at the base of claiming the international style to be universally acceptable. From this understanding, the planning of the city became an engineering fact with the ambition of being able to predict and accommodate the complexity of the urban fact for whichever community in whatever time. The modern architects committed to this gigantic task, blinded with the arrogant attitude of believing being in possession of the truth, dismissed radically the consideration about the way of living of the communities and the emotional comfort of their homes coming from the social bondings. These were insignificant pieces of the urban machine, not that important for a smooth run. Recently, Isabella Stengers questions this blindness coming from the belief of possession of knowledge, absolute knowledge, and advises toward a more cosmopolitical plural accommodation of various forms of knowledge system, epistemes, not just uncritically upholding a scientific epistemology. If we think now about the suburban phenomenon, from the English new towns to the American sprawl, we recognize the presence of the other blinding factor mentioned by Lefebvre, ideology. The suburban city was ideologically charged in two ways, from the bottom up and from the top bottom, which is to say from the inhabitants' perspective and also from the administration's perspective, respectively. From the user's point of view, the proposal was appealing because it was based in an ideal way of living that resisted the existing city conditions, urban and communal, for promoting an individualistic life in a more rural context. From the perspective of the administration, the operation was charged with an economic and political ideology that tried to pass unnoticed, but no less authoritarian. In the English new towns, the proposal was a hidden system of land property nationalization because it gave the government a protected privilege to acquire land as rural and sell it as urban, getting back with this an important added value. In the case of the American suburban development, the relationship between the sprawl phenomenon and the government financial support benefiting the interstate highway system instead of promoting the urban public transportation is very well known. It clearly shows ideological statements being manifested which favored the car and the mass-produced houses industries. In both cases, the English and the American, the government support for the suburban was also a tacit political ideology of mass control through isolation. So ideology was, in a very wide sense, the blinding factor for projecting the suburban, focusing on an individual perspective with dismissal of the city and community approaches. Third places are also where political dissent happens and communities are shaped. Hence, it is easy to notice the simultaneous decimation of both the third places and politically mature citizens. The case in point is the election in 2016. Now, in the case of the American New Urbanism, we find a subversion of ideology as the blinding factor, which is demagogy. This concept is a popularization of ideology and is a political ruse based on invoking people's emotions instead of people's reason, more as a marketing strategy. New urbanism, in essence, is, as David Harvey mentioned, a communitarian trap, selling to the people an idea of community, privileging spatial form over social processes, as Harvey mentioned, resulting in ghettos where people are willing to live attracted by the social image of living in a more elite community and motivated more by that fact rather than a communitarian shared experience. As Harvey pointed, living in community in new urbanism is a code word for controlling the community as a guarantee of social order. The accumulation of keep out signs and the deathly calm of most of the new urbanism development a very clear proof of these realities. To build places people love, then which is the new urbanism's motto, is the peak of demagogic rhetoric, a blatant call to the people's emotional affinity where architects renounce, or should we more properly say sell, their competences. There resides a total misunderstanding of architecture, which is a public service, and as in any other professionally curated public service, the goal is to deliver the best quality product for the well-being of the people, both as an individual and as a community. Case in point is a doctor not only being responsible for the personal health, but also for the public health issues. No doctor would recommend junk food even if people love it, because this would be a dismissal of his or her professional competence. In any other socially engaged professional role, the new urbanism motto sounds unprofessional to say the least. As knowledge, ideology, and its populist version, demagogy, have been blinding factors responsible for the strange disconnection between cities, communities, homes, and that we're analyzing, at least in the most significant planning trends throughout the 20th century. For keeping this problem in the future, we would need a radical paradigmatic shift, one that is not based on the trueness of a single ideology or knowledge system. The new paradigm will have to be plural and employ a trans logic that allows for starting with blind fields rather than the object, which is the homes and the cities themselves. Richard Sennett explained in his paper The Open City that we are unnaturally expecting too high a degree of perfection from the city, and this could be applied to the other scales included, both communities and homes. The city must be clean and safe, with efficient public services and economy, and also be able to provide cultural stimulation and promote equality in all levels, racial, social, and economic. And this is kind of like our demand from the city constantly. This is the same as to think about the city as a closed system, which means the absolute prevalence of a coherence when, as Sennett said, dissonance is a more strong condition in a contemporary life. The tendency to understand the city as a closed system also entails the rejection of any phenomenon that doesn't fit the clean classifications. As Sennett argued, there are contestatory or disorienting, which is another way to understand the dismissal of the in-betweenness, which we mentioned are the Lefebvreian blinded fields. These ideas are not different to Lefebvre's conclusion in the Urban Revolution, where he complained about the fact that concrete spaces has been replaced with abstract spaces. Concrete spaces is not only physical but also metaphysical, including the intangible, and especially we could say they are also pataphysical, which means the inclusion of the exceptional. Hence, it is extremely difficult to be planned in a closed way, where we can predict everything beforehand. The architect and the planner have been traditionally working in an abstract space with the illusion that things can be overdetermined, and from their abstract world, they can reproduce the wild and the exciting reality of lived experiences with all its contradictions and conflicts. When Senate claimed for the qualities that has to be considered for the design of the open city, they were namely blurry edges, incomplete forms, unresolved narrative, which allow for uncertainties and lack of knowledge. He is insisting in the Lefebvreian ideologic by blinded factors. Knowledge takes us to the definition of concept, which also means the clarity in the determination of borders and shapes, a closedness rather than an openness. An ideology is the background for the resolved narratives. In order to have a resolved narratives, ideologies must be specifically maintained. We need to avoid both as determinants of urbanism. We need to be emancipated from their stronghold on the discipline of architecture so that we can imagine beyond the given frames. This emphasis between the open and the closed, the concrete and the abstract, and the way that all of these is entangled with the ideologic background is also a recognition of the paradigm shift from modernity to transmodernity. In our trans world, strict classification are not valid anymore because we know nowadays that the significant concepts always unfold in between the formal, always in flux in the informal spaces. Because of these, the future design of the city cannot be accomplished without thinking of the way in which the familiar life of every citizen unfolds in a more specific community and how communities interact in the discussion and construction of the city. It cannot be designed without dismissing the connection between the political consciousness of every citizen and his or her most intimate self. Rather than a generic conceptual understanding, we would like to propose third places as a design heuristic towards rejuvenating the connection between the home and the city, fostering a community. The case in point, as you can see in the slide, is the design of a senior living, a mixed inclusive housing in Freeman, South Dakota, designed by the University of Arkansas Community Design Center, in which we were involved professionally, where we started with the porch as a third place, and then the porch was hybridized into something that we call the hyper porch, and from which the houses kind of like grew. So this was starting with the porch and then going towards the home, but simultaneously, which we are saying is the trans logic, that it simultaneously went and defined the home, but also it was starting to define the urban places. So it kind of also gave the formation of the city. Placing third places on the design agenda is a move towards uniting the neighborhood. What we suggest is that the design of the homes must begin with an active consideration of community spaces such as the yards, the garages, the porches, the patios, and design investigation must develop new typologies of informal communal spaces where people come together spontaneously, but not in a prescribed formal community center. Older typologies such as the coffee houses, bars, and taverns needs to be reinserted into the city fabric to give a social life, a home away from home. Beyond the blinding effect of rigid ideological and or epistemic stances, trans design configuration need to factor in the in-between socio-spatial aspects of the homes, communities, and cities. Only when we allow the design to have such oscillations between the physical to the metaphysical and to the pataphysical without being dogmatic can there be a cure to our collective blindness. And as we said, cure for blindness, places that afford spontaneity, affords the strange, allows the non-planned, and fosters bonding that people did not plan. And people, when we allow the consciousness of the individual to expand in that way, those third places start to foster a sense of community, and that we can say contributes towards an urban collective consciousness. And that is all that we have. Thank you so much. And please visit our website at www.thisstudioisopen.org, and you can contribute in any way, and we welcome all criticisms. And thank you so much.